We've got one more minute, but I think we can start. Seeing no public comments, do I have to approve the agenda? Approval for the agenda?
So moved.
Support.
All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Seeing no public comment, we'll go right to the legislative updates.
All right, great. Just a little bit, there hasn't been a whole lot of change since we last met. So I'm going to go through the list, and I'm going to ask Mr. Glass, who's closer on the ground, to correct me when I'm wrong or to add when there's more to add. But you know, we saw the governor's executive budget that was introduced. We are expecting the House and the Senate appropriations subcommittees are going to release their budgets within the week or so.
As soon as this week, yeah.
As soon as this week. So we'll have a better idea of what, if anything, they're going to be doing differently than the governor. And then we really don't anticipate action until the May revenue estimating conference. So that's why typically the budgets are done so late, is because they're waiting to see what that revenue estimating conference is going to bring. And then from there, at least everything we're anticipating is that they're going to continue to try to get it done before July 1st. Any questions on that right offhand? Again, this is still one of the best budgets we've had yet. We'll keep you posted. As soon as we get stuff from the House and the Senate, we'll share it with the committee.
The biggest potential change is just within the pupil membership allocation. So right now we get 90% of our funding based on the fall count of the current year, 10% based on prior spring. The governor proposed a 50-50 split. I don't think the Senate and the House are going to be willing to go as far as the governor did. So you could be looking at the House moving forward with the same 90-10, and you could look at the Senate going somewhere probably 75-25. So 75 current fall, 25 previous spring, which you guys had a pretty strong spring count. So either way, I think you're in a good position with the pupil membership blend as it pertains to that.
Yep.
Seems like it would be good. Remember the old days when we used to get update from the CFO on what the different versions would mean and how they would impact our budget? I think that would be of value to have Larry do that in April once the Senate House versions come out.
Okay.
To the Board of Ed.
Be good.
Yeah.
That would be a good idea.
Sorry, just want to make sure I take that. You want to have Larry O come here and we'll present that at your April meeting, or are you just talking in
I
general?
think to the Board of Ed.
We could probably, usually the budgets, there's a form, and once you build one, it's easy to plug all the districts in. So
Right.
with the support of the ISD, we can help.
All right, House Bill 5194, the calendar bill, there's been no new action. As you might recall, this was one that was in committee. Teresa did testify, and then within about a week later, they passed it out of committee, and it's sitting and waiting action on the House floor. Have you heard anything new on any potential floor action?
Not in the immediate future. Detroit Public Schools is pretty much taking up all the energy of Representative Garcia, who's the sponsor of that bill. So the good news is, for the fate of the bill, she included that same provision within the DPS package. So it's clear she has an interest in seeing it move. It's just she's got her hands full right now with the DPS issue.
Good. House Bill 4822, third grade reading. Right. Again, you might recall that this had passed the House. It's now in the Senate. We're hearing that the committee is likely to take action, and it could be even floor action within the next week or two. You want to expound on that, Chris, a little bit more?
Yeah, so the committee will meet tomorrow. They just came out with an updated substitute version. It's likely they'll vote that out of committee tomorrow. And then the question is, do they have enough time before they go on spring break to move it on the Senate floor? So those who are pushing for the bill, they certainly want it to be done before it moves or before they go on break.
How does it differ? What's in the committee right now? How is it differing from the House version?
So the most substantial difference is the allowance of a parent opt-out option with the superintendent approval. There also is the ability of an administrator and teacher to make a determination what's in the best interest of the student for a good cause exemption as well. So that is where we found the majority of states who do have early literacy policies have gone to where there is a line in the sand that says this is where we expect kids to be, but there is that professional opinion to be brought into the matter, which is something that's certainly welcome. So that's where the Senate went. We were pleased with all the work that we did in the House. That was really the last bit of direction you could go in and improve the bill. So that's one of the strategies that we've put in place with our advocacy, is at every point of the way, every step of the process, how can you mold, shape, improve the legislation that's before you, and then understand it is a long process. So what starts out as an introduced bill is likely to take on changes, and that's what we're always pushing for.
I don't know why I left this one on here. We've already talked about the critical shortage, so we'll skip that. Senate Bill 754 to 767, these are the bills that would streamline or eliminate rules and regulations. And right now, there's been no new action. It's sitting in the Senate Education Committee. I don't know if are you hearing anything about movement on this one, or is this, again, DPS is kind of sucking the life of everyone?
Likely to move after they get back from spring break. They kind of took testimony on it and then brought in the third grade reading bill. So that one kind of moved ahead of the regulation bills.
Great. And then the Detroit Public Schools, I'm going to defer to Chris a lot on this one because
Before you go to that, you have sinking fund on your agenda.
Oh, I'm
there.
sorry, I skipped that. House Bill 4388, sinking fund. Second reading in House Appropriations, last I heard.
Yeah, so did vote out of House Appropriations on a 29-0 vote. So that was a very positive step. And then we've been working with leadership to help them further understand the issue from a taxpayer perspective, because that's their number one concern and interest about how it saves taxpayer resources. We've also been partnering with our statewide associations to ask them which communities will be having a sinking fund renewal or a sinking fund request within the next 12 months. And the reason why that's important is because that will allow us to approach those legislators to say, this bill will have significant implications on those particular requests, and we ask for your urging of leadership to move it through the process. So nothing at this point in time that suggests there's a reason why it's delayed. Again, it's just one of two things. If it's not a top priority of leadership or the governor, then it's a matter of the members of the legislature creating the sense of urgency around the legislation, which is what we're in the process of doing.
On Detroit Public, I think the one notable thing to report is that the House did approve $47.8 million supplemental funding. And part of the controversy is that it's like the first or second week in April, Detroit Public Schools will be out of money. They will not be able to meet payroll. And so this is being treated as a quote-unquote down payment on the $515 million debt that they have. And there's just been a lot of back and forth. You have the House version of the legislation that wants to take it to an extreme. You have the Senate version that's certainly in line with the governor. And I have not followed it close enough. There's been a lot of back and forth on where this is. I got the impression that they were going to, we'll likely see the Senate take action on the appropriations, and it'll at least put that behind them so they can now, because right now they've kind of got a gun to their head. And, the funding has to happen at some point, but the legislature just hasn't had enough time to really work it through, so.
Yeah, so the House side, they've taken over 80 hours of testimony to date, which is pretty significant. That rarely happens to that degree at the committee level. To the credit and, depending on where you sit, to the detriment of the bills that are being proposed, because I think members are getting a much stronger understanding of the complexity of the issue. And that it's not simply just kind of talking point policies that you move through, but rather there's implications to each one of the bills. So I think they felt comfortable certainly agreeing that there is the financial responsibility that the state has, and two, the other thing there was an understanding on was there is an agreement on the legislative path yet. And so with that being said, they did approve that short-term cash infusion, which will get them through the school year. It also allows them, like John said, time to debate the policies further, and depending on if you want to look at it with politics coming into play, does it push past election season or not? So like John said, though, the Senate is much closer to the governor's proposal, so we'll see where that goes.
So it's really total is really
515.
That is just for the debt. That's operational debt. That's not bond debt. That's just short-term loans, numerous ones that got converted into longer-term loans that then have come to this point.
And isn't it actually closer to 700 or almost 800 million with the total I thought I
Yeah.
saw a figure of 780 that's sticking in my head for some reason.
Yeah, so the governor's proposal actually allocated an additional 200 million to the new district. One, understanding there's probably likely to be continued declining enrollment, and two, thinking there needs to be investments to facilities and curriculum and things like that to actually get the district off on the right foot, so that we're not, back in this position 3, 4, 5 years. That's been pretty contentious. I think that is likely going to be a 200 million that's going to be under negotiation, and I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't see that in the final proposal.
Yeah, that's where his was the 515 to retire for the old school, new school.
Yep.
And then the 200 million to boost the successor district's chances of success, I suppose, is what. Any questions on that? All right, the next one, we actually have bill numbers, and I apologize I didn't update the agenda, but for the special education, you'll recall that the Lieutenant Governor did release his report. This is based on what was presented to the board as well. You recall at your board retreat where we walked through the details of it. We got our first glimpse of the legislation. That's House Bills 5409 to 5418. And this is largely focused on the emergency seclusion and restraint, as well as requiring the state board to adopt a statewide policy around the seclusion and restraint. It also requires that a local district would adopt similar policies to align with the state, and to ensure that that policy also includes a consistent statewide policy for school-wide positive behavior intervention and support. So the good news is PBIS, we're already leap years ahead of several of our colleagues around the state.
Almost everybody.
Yeah. And so
Very good, you think, isn't it?
now that we know the legislation, at some point, I think it would be good, if not today, if you wanted to talk it through, but it may be at the next meeting, we'd come with a recommendation. We should be taking a position. We believe this legislation is in line with what we believe is the approach of the board, as well as this administration toward special education improvements, and this is...
Can you send us the bills and the analysis?
Yep.
That'd be great.
And that's all I have on updates. Shall we move on to the next one?
Yeah.
All right. Chris has prepared a nice little PowerPoint slide here, so he'll walk
Awesome.
you through this.
You gonna put it up on the screen?
We weren't, just because it's
Okay,
easier to
that's
just
fine.
look at it here, I think, than for you guys to turn around and...
And we do have great updates in greater detail, depending on how, deep you want to get into this. I think the thing to understand, Congress, right before
Can't believe they
Christmas.
changed the name again.
Can you believe it? Imagine that, another acronym in
Why do they just go
education.
back to, it's so close to ESEA. Like, why, they should just,
Yep.
they should have just gone back to ESEA.
We still have ESEA, but the proposal within ESEA is now ESSA instead of NCLB.
Got it.
So, alphabet soup in that context.
It includes IDEA and...
Put it out there. So Congress approved this right before they left for Christmas recess. The governor signed it. Now what's really happening is the rubber's hitting the road with the rules-making and implementation process at the Department of Education level. So really what the legislation seeks to do is set those guiding parameters by which then the federal government is responsible and the Department of Education is responsible for the implementation of it. And I think the biggest thing to take a look at, if you turn to the first page there, is what they're trying to do is move to a position of support and strengthen, as opposed to dictate and prescribe, which is what we've been under for quite some time. Every significant education policy that you've seen move in the state of Michigan over the last 15 years has had a reference to a federal mandate that we must, comply with. And when we've taken the pulse on what's happening in the federal government, there's a big swing back to states' rights, right? The pendulum swung too far for federal overreach. Now it's
So-
heading back to states' rights.
During the whole race to the top, there was a lot of legislation that got pushed through to comply with that. Do you think there'll be a reexamination of some of that policy? that was kind of dictated from the federal government?
There certainly could be a
Like some of the,
reexamination of it.
in terms of how to handle the priority schools and that kind of thing?
Yeah, one of the things that we'll touch on is in regards to the turnaround models. So there still is the identification of that lowest 5%, but the state has complete flexibility in what they ask local districts to do in terms of
I
models
should probably just
to
let you
pick.
finish.
That's all right.
Before
Hey,
I ask you a question.
very flexible.
Okay.
So now the pillars of the federal government's involvement still center around equity, accountability, standards, and assessments. So one, we need to identify somehow where schools are at as it pertains to performance, academic performance. The second is we're trying to get some equity through title resources, additional supports coming from the federal government to those students who need those supports most. So that's still there. And then the other is standards. How do we make sure every state is implementing high standards? Now, the difference is there is strong language in there to where it basically precludes or doesn't allow the federal government Department of Education to incentivize the adoption of standards, which will get you to a lot of the Common Core conversations that have been taking place. So they really wanted to kind of have that language in there to say that is the state's rights to pick whatever standards they want. The only thing that is a certainty is they must be high standards, which of course is never defined, but Michigan does have high standards in place, and it's unlikely that our standards will change anytime in the near future. So what does it mean for assessment? There's not a whole lot of change around assessment. We're still going to have to assess kids grades 3 through 8 in math and English language arts, and we're still going to have to assess once in high school, and science will be included in that at every grade span, so elementary, middle, and high school. So no changes there as it pertains to the assessments, and it does allow for computer adaptive testing, which is where we're headed in order to get an understanding of how much students have grown throughout their academic career. As far as participation, there still is a 95% threshold there, so that didn't change. One of the things that did change, though, is there's greater flexibility for opt-outs for parents who feel like, the state assessment is not in the best interest of their child. There isn't as strong of penalties as there used to be for those opt-out provisions. So states will have some jurisdiction to kind of navigate those waters on their own, depending on how they want to push forward. So that brings us past the standards page and into the accountability section. The thing to understand is right now we're operating under NCLB, No Child Left Behind, and the waiver that the Department of Education put forward. We are still required through the school year to submit all the data, submissions, all of those things that the waiver has put in place. Next year, though, is a transition year. So that's a year where we will not have to submit nearly as much data per NCLB, but the funding streams will continue just as they did in the school year 2015-16. So you should expect to be held, harmless in the sense of funding from the federal government sources for next school year. The difference is that the state really takes the lead on its accountability system and that structure, and there's a transition period to get you ready for full implementation, which will be 2017 and 18.
So will the state maintain their criteria for determining the priority schools are about in 5% that they did in the waiver? Are they going to continue the waiver language?
It's likely there'll be right now there's subgroups committees meeting within MDE to look at the accountability system and assessment structure, and I think you're going to see changes put forward to that structure. The thing that we've had extreme reservations about with the top to bottom list, which is where they find those priority and focus designations, is the high correlation to poverty. And we need to do a better job as a state of identifying those schools, no matter where you're at on the poverty spectrum. If you have room to improve, you have room to improve. Just because you're a poor school, we shouldn't bucket everybody together and label them as a failure.
I know some of the other states had much more sophisticated and progressive measurements that, had kind of, were really looking at a growth model, so you didn't end up just penalizing poor children. In schools that served them, are they looking at the other states, what they've done, or?
They are examining them. I think there's a fear or reservation about the whole value-added concept and what you put into a statistical black box and what it spits out. But there are statistical ways to introduce things like a poverty correlation, things of that nature, to where it does a similar thing but in a more transparent way, to where people don't feel like they're allowing the Department of Education to figure out what the potential of a child is and then spit out that number. So I think the data and the privacy component, much like the federal standards, the Common Core, really pushed that back a little bit in Michigan. The states that did do it were ones who did receive Race to the Top funds for that implementation back in the 2009 era there. So they kind of got ahead of a lot of those concerns, and Michigan did not receive those funds, and so their systems were significantly underdeveloped as it pertains to that. So the other side, we already spoke about this, the bottom 5% still must be identified. The interesting part, though, when we look at accountability, the states really do have the flexibility to, when they're developing their accountability systems, to not have it be so weighted on a high-stakes test. And so 51% of the accountability system per the federal government must be on academic standards. That can be proficiency, that can be any measure within the accountability realm there. So student growth is also a component that can be included there, but 49% can be in external factors that support student learning. So attendance, parent surveys, things that you guys have already
School
incorporated.
climate, teacher engagement, tripod survey type stuff.
You're in a strong position there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's
And
fantastic.
I think that's going to be an area where we really push in terms of the state to make sure that if we have this flexibility, let's take advantage of it. Let's make sure we're setting ourselves up for not getting too overly prescriptive and weighted on assessment, the one-time shot, and really take a look at the complete picture of the whole child and how do we create a system that supports
Yeah,
that.
that's great. You hate to see schools that you know are moving in the right direction be for some reform model that isn't looking at all the indicators.
Absolutely. The other thing is there's still going to be school improvement plans, things of that nature. The state will still be in oversight mode in terms of are you making progress on those plans that are put in place for priority and focus schools. And then beyond that, the state does have the ability through policy to determine what they do with schools that they do not deem are making progress. So I think we're going to have a reexamination of those closure models, the transformation model. Even this brings in the SSRO, the State School Reform Office, and what kind of steps or measures they take. So that is likely going to, at some point, open up that whole 1280C piece of legislation. And I think people have an understanding now that it's a lot more difficult to improve academic performance. And Mayor Duggan has done a nice job within Detroit Public Schools of laying out the perspective that it's best done locally.
Yeah.
And there are very few instances to where state oversight of a school building has resulted in significant improvement. So, and that's a
You heard it
conversation
here,
that's taking
people.
place.
We quote you on that.
Well, and when we met with the SRO not long ago, well, when we first met with it, we were asking, okay, well, what's your criteria? What are you using to determine which schools are picked, to be potentially taken over by the state or for further corrective action? And they couldn't spell it out. There was no clearly defined criteria. So hopefully this will give us the opportunity to dive in a little deeper.
So moving forward into the title section, school improvement grants are going to be consolidated within Title I funding. Now, they will have a certain percentage similar to where it's at now, carved out, that must be used on school supports or transformational models is what they call it, or innovational models. So that's there. Portability is out, so this is deemed as a positive by the school community, and it's replaced with a weighted formula, so you don't have as much prescription in what you do with the resources and how you allocate those things. So that was viewed as a positive as well. The state and the locals also must continue maintenance of effort as it pertains to Title I supports. So the definition for the federal government is you need to make sure you're at least allocating 90% of the resources you did the prior year to support those efforts. And that is what we have as it pertains to ESSA. As I mentioned, the rules-making process is happening right now from the federal government. That guidance will continue to come out of the federal government and will inform the state subcommittees and the work that's happening at the state level to develop these accountability systems and the new, what we're likely to operate under for the next decade or so
Besides what you mentioned here on the school improvement grants and the portability, does this reauthorization impact the allocation of title funds in any significant way? How they're,
Title funds will, that formula remains unchanged, so that will stay consistent. There were ideas in both the House and Senate, different ideas on changing that, but they didn't come to agreement, so title resources will be allocated the same way.
There was some change around the ELL, here it is, the English Language Learners Accountability. The accountability for ELL shifted from Title III to Title I, so it kind of puts it all under the Title I umbrella, which we think will probably be a good thing. But we still have to kind of study to see what more that looks like. That's the accountability side, but will that Title III funding get grouped in, do we know? So again, some of this, we're still kind of waiting for them to give us more information about how things are going to be implemented, but that was one other change I'd note.
That's a common trend we've seen in workforce development funding and things of that nature, where there were so many separate segregated buckets. How do we have bigger buckets and more flexibility at the state level for those funds to flow through?
What did they say? There's 50 different pots of funds that are going to be sourced into one block grant, and I believe that's all coming under Title I now.
The good news is, we do have a speaker that I mentioned the last time we were here coming, and she'll be here on April 20th. So we'll make sure an invitation gets to the Board of Education members to participate and listen to Noelle Ellerson. She is the Associate Executive Director for the National Superintendents Association. So she worked very closely with this legislation. She continues to work closely in the rules-making process, and she'll be able to give us a better understanding of the policy.
what time is that?
So that will be 1:30 to 3 on April 20th.
Staff meeting. Where is it at?
It'll be at the ISD. And why is this important? In speaking to the Legislative Committee, the West Michigan Talent Triangle Legislative Committee, of which Teresa sits on, a lot of the provisions and things that we operate right under state law right now, many feel that the Department of Education, along with lawmakers, went beyond even what No Child Left Behind required. A lot of that as it pertains to subgroups, those sorts of things. And so what we want to be able to do, since we have representation on each of the subgroups in MDE, is to be able to have our superintendents have an understanding of what the federal law requires. That way, when they're engaging in conversations at the department level, they can shape that in a more constructive way as it pertains to not just saying,
That's great.
accepting what the Department of Education is saying the direction we should go. So it's a more inclusive way to engage in this process, which we think will be helpful.
That's awesome.
I think it is too.
Great idea.
A small travel stipend can go a long way.
I missed we didn't have the advocacy conference this year because of a snowstorm in DC, and that's usually my
That's right.
cheat sheet to the federal world of education policy. So now I'm just dependent on you, Chris.
It's a big ball of wax.
Questions?
No.
No, thank you.
The only other thing I would just add is, again, that's a conversation about April 12th, a capital day.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at 8:30 to 4, so the idea would be
I
to,
changed my calendar when Raynard gave the heads up. Thank you. I would have, so I.
and if that day doesn't work, we can look
Oh,
at
I already
something else.
moved everything now.
Okay, all right. Well, we had put that out there quite some time ago,
Yeah,
but
well,
we're
you said
just
Rusty
getting...
had things set up, so,
Yep.
and in panic,
Yep.
I moved all my appointments.
So I guess the question, it sounds like you're out. Are you both in? Okay, good. We can carpool if you'd like. I can certainly drive. I don't know if you want to meet at the Park and Ride or meet here or whatever's convenient for you.
At what, 8:30 you said? What time?
Yep. Well, we
need
want to
leave
meet
here
at
about-
7:30
Yeah,
and meet
so
Rusty at 8:30. I think the first meeting is set for 9.
Park and ride's fine for me.
Do the Park and Ride on the Beltline. It's probably the easiest. Okay.
How you feel?
That weekend.
Are you the only one going,
I'll
Mo?
be back on the 11th.
Are you going to go out to the DC thing? Yeah, in June.
June or July.
Yeah. That's another thing we do need to put back out about, for the board. I don't know if Julie's put the reschedule of the
I know, I need to
FRN.
let her know that I can't go in June. They rescheduled the advocacy conference for June,
June what?
and I'm out of the country then.
June what?
I'm not sure if I have it in front of me here. Let me see.
Oh, I probably can't
Oops. I believe it's the 12th, excuse me, the 11th through the 14th.
The warm months.
Well, right?
go. Yeah, no,
I mean, literally in 3 of the last 5 times I've gone to DC, our flights got canceled and changed in some way, shape, or form. We were stranded.
One quick question though, as I look at all this stuff here, maybe it's my ignorance, but I would have thought when we start talking about some of these flexible things that the state has the ability to make decisions about, that a lot of that would fall on the state board of ed. But it sounds like you were saying that a lot of that is falling on committees in the House and the Senate.
So there's, the state superintendent, as a part of his Top 10 and 10 initiative, set up 3 subcommittees with superintendents and other, administrative leadership teams: accountability, assessment, and funding.
Okay.
And so he's really looking at those groups to come to consensus. And as he said, when he walked in the door, no preconceived notion about where we're headed as a department or what we've done in the past, just what's best for students in Michigan. Those committees were well under the way in their work, and then all of a sudden, Congress acted when nobody thought they were going to act on anything. And so what he did was he took a pause and said, hey, let's give ourselves a month or two to have a better understanding of what ESSA, what flexibility it provides us before we come to some conclusions with those committees. So those recommendations will be put within the state plan, which the state board will approve, that heads off to DC. Now, at any point in time, the legislature, and there hasn't been any conversation to date, but they can insert themselves and with laws that would guide where the department can or cannot go. And there might be suggestions based on the work that's being done of laws that need to change in order to get us to the place that we're best supporting students in the state. So those recommendations could be forthcoming as well.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you.